What's up, Motorheads? Welcome to F1 Technology in Perspective. I'm Scott Vick, one of your intrepid hosts. With me, as always, is my co-host, Corey Brune, where we're going to talk about the latest round of the F1 World Championship, but we're going to put it in historical perspective and talk about the latest racing technology. Corey, how you doing today?
It's been a brutal day, but the weekend, it did not disappoint. There's plenty.
No, it did not. No, it did not. So we had our annual trip down under to the Australian Grand Prix. It's always, both from a fan favorite, a driver favorite. The teams love going down there because there's such a party atmosphere down there. Fantastic venue. So, it's and Australia rarely ever disappoints from a racing perspective. And this year is no exception. So,
Right.
Great track. So, the F1 has been going down officially to Australia since 1985. Did the first 11 years in Adelaide as a street race, which all the drivers loved it. It was a very technical, very tricky street track. And then in 1996, we moved to Melbourne. Not without some controversies. A lot of the tree huggers and everybody said, people said, why are we, spending all this taxpayer money to go down to, to basically shut down this public park to make it a private playground for, a week every year and stuff. And so, they dispute the economic impact of it and everything, even though it's been proven time and time again. Oh yeah. They say, I think it's, the Melbourne, the city government says that it brings in somewhere between $32 and $39 million every year in economic. That's the economic impact beyond, that they're saying that's like, what the money that it brings in above and beyond what they spend to, to bring the race in and everything. So it's I think it's ridiculous. Yeah, exactly. So Melbourne, great track, had some just absolutely amazing moments. We had our, within the first three corners of the very first race there in 1996, we had, put Melbourne center stage and the world's consciousness. We saw Martin Brundle get launched, turned upside down, slide through the gravel trap at the first turn, gets out of the car and trots back into the pits, goes to Sid Watson, who's who at the time was the medical director for the FIA, and basically said, "Clear me to race." And Sid looked him over, said, "You're good to go." So this was back in the good old days, back when the teams would still have, they would have, a car for each of the drivers, and then they would also bring a backup car. And if the race was red flagged within the first couple, I think it was the first 3 laps, then if a driver's car was knocked out, then that driver had the option of restarting the race in the backup car. And so that's exactly what Martin Brundle did. Is he trotted back down there, got the clearance, jumped in the backup car and took the restart.
Nice. Yeah.
Yep.
Now, what place did you get?
I don't remember. I will have to look that up. But if I remember correctly, he actually had a pretty good finish that race. So I want to say it was 5th or 6th, but don't quote me on that.
Nice.
So, and then this also had its share of controversies. In 1998, David Coulthard and Mika Hakkinen for McLaren just absolutely blitzed the field. The two of them just literally lapped the entire rest of the field that year. But the main controversy came from is that Coulthard and Hakkinen had a gentleman's agreement that whoever was first to the corner was the first one through turn 1 would win the race. And Hakkinen had actually beat Coulthard to the first turn at the beginning of the race, but Coulthard was actually leading towards the end, and he actually pulled over and allowed Hakkinen to pass him so that he could honor their agreement to let him win. Yeah.
That's
so
awesome.
A lot of people, got very upset about that, saying, it took it. diminish the importance of the racing and everything. And it's like, no, these gentlemen agreements have been in a place forever, sometimes not always honored, but they've been in place since the beginning of the sport. And, it's just, this was one of those times where it was much more pronounced in the fact that, these guys were actually honoring their agreement.
Wow, you're nice.
So, yeah. And then also, Melbourne, because traditionally, in the beginning, Adelaide was always the closing race of the season. As we talked about in the last podcast, Adelaide used to be the closing race of the season. And then when they moved to Melbourne, it became usually the season's opener, or it was always within the first one or two races of the opening of the season. And so we've seen a number of drivers become, make their first starts in Formula One in Melbourne. And then we've also had some very memorable debuts in the fact that Kevin Magnussen, his very first start for McLaren, he was on the podium, finished third in his very first Grand Prix. And same thing with Lewis Hamilton, that in his Grand Prix debut with McLaren, he was on the podium in Melbourne. So, and
cool.
some of the other, and then some of the other memorable debuts. Let's see here. I've got my notes here of some of the more memorable debuts, which I cannot find in my notes now all of a sudden. So, but I mean, you've had, because it had being the beginning of, one of the first, at that point was, the first race of the season. I mean, you saw Sebastian Vettel, Mark Webber, some of the, Fernando Alonso, Hamilton, Magnussen, a lot of, great names that have made their Formula One debut in Melbourne. So just like I said, just a great venue, and just pretty much universally loved by the teams and by the by the teams and the drivers and everything. So okay, so let's transition into the technical updates. So not a lot of updates among the team, especially among the top four, with the exception of one minor update for Mercedes, which we'll get into in just a minute when we talk about Mercedes. But some of the other noticeable ones was Alpine showed up with a reprofiled halo to take and try to help a little bit more with the airflow as it came around as they channel it around the halo down the side pods. You had McLaren showed up with some new floor fences to take and try to help with the airflow, and a much more compact engine cover, which I think lent itself to their, I wouldn't say resurgence, but they're, much better showing this weekend than what they've done in the first two races. And we'll get into that more in just a little bit. Alfa Romeo showed up with a new nose and new wing mirrors again to take and try to help with, airflow over the car. AlphaTauri showed up with a completely new floor for the car, as well as a brand new diffuser. And then Williams showed up with a new set of rear wing end plates, which I think was a major help in their showing this weekend by as they talked about during the Sky Sports telecast, they were talking about how much better the Williams was that in a straight line than a lot of the cars, because it seemed to be far less draggy than a lot of the other cars and everything. And a lot of that could be brought down to the changes that they made to the rear wing end plates.
Yeah, it's funny. I didn't really notice Williams, but I did see Alpine as well as Alfa Romeo. It seemed that the last few races, just Bottas just seems like he's just struggling. Is it? Yeah, I know we don't have this on, but I mean, do you think is that just him not getting used to the car? Because his first year with Alpha, he seemed to do fantastic, and now it seems like just like at Mercedes, where Russell's continuously beating Hamilton. I shouldn't say continuously, but the last few races has been, and last year was
Hmm.
led him by 30 or 40 points. And now we're seeing the same kind of thing happening with Bottas. It was Zoe as well. So, I mean, what do you think there? You think that it's just the new updates? He's just not understanding those updates, or not working well with them? What do you think that would be?
No, with Alpha, it all boils down to the new car. They made some significant suspension changes over the winter
Mm,
to the car, and I think it boils down to is that Bottas is having a much more difficult time coming to grips with the suspension changes. In fact, it was commented several times during the Sky Sports broadcasts of the free practices and qualifying that there was, I believe it was either FP2 or FP3, that Bottas was even late hitting the track because they were still making significant changes
oh
to the
wow.
suspension at the last minute,
Yeah.
leading up to the practice sessions and everything, in order to make the car more to Bottas's liking. So
Hmm.
yeah, I think it really boils down to that's the reason why Joe is doing so much better right now over Bottas, as he's been able to come to grips with the new suspension changes better than Valtteri has, and I think
Yeah.
that's what it boils down to.
Well, I guess the same thing with Russell, right? I mean, Russell had, and we talked about this, I think, in our first podcast, where Russell was coming from a really horrible car at Williams, and then you put him in uh, a great car with Mercedes, and he's able to adapt much faster than Lewis, who's always had a great car, then went to a not as great car. So it
Yes.
seems like that he's able to make that transition a lot easier. So that's interesting. Okay.
Yep.
So you want to switch gears and start talking through the chaos. Red flags, I think, right? It was the most red flags in history, in F1 history, right?
I don't believe so.
Oh,
I
okay.
believe there was one other race where they had 4 red flags, but don't quote me
Ah,
on that. I
okay.
was
Yeah.
trying to research that before we came on, and I couldn't find the information I was looking for. So I can update on that later on. But yeah, it was definitely a wild race, and the fact that for the number of red flags and safety cars and things like that.
So now we can switch gears and talk about the chaos that ensued at over on Sunday. Just I guess
Yeah.
starting out at the first red flag, we had three, uh, and that last one I really want to concentrate on. But let's talk about that first red flag that we had with Albon.
Yeah, the first one with Albon Shunt was completely warranted because he came across, hits the barrier, bounces halfway back onto the track, and drags a ton of the kitty litter out onto the track. Which, of course, I mean, if you look at it on the replay and everything, I mean, there was literally rocks and gravel and everything strewn across the entire width of the track. So they absolutely had to red flag it in order to clean all that up, because
Right.
otherwise it was, you're going to
Too
have
dangerous.
way too much of a chance, if without, if they're trying to clean it up while cars are passing by and
Mm,
everything, there's every chance that they're going to go across there where they haven't cleaned up some of those rocks, and somebody's going to wind up with a puncture and everything. So I think
right.
it was definitely warranted, because that way there was a couple cars that were right behind Albon. I think it was the Alfa Romeo of Joe Granu, and I believe it was maybe one of the Alpha Tauris, but there was at least 2 cars that came through right after Albon's shunt that went through
Mm-hmm.
that gravel, and by red flagging it, they got to go into the pits, got basically a free tire change,
Yeah.
and
Right.
mitigated that issue. So I think it was totally warranted, to do the first red flag. Yeah, no, I mean, no question.
So after Albon's crash, we go into K Mag, right? At first, I thought it
Hmm.
was really odd because over the radio, they were saying that he had a broken suspension, which he did, but it wasn't. It's because he hit a wall. it,
Yep, exactly.
it was
That was
broken
one
because,
of
yeah.
Yeah, it was definitely a broken suspension from him hitting the wall, and it was definitely one of the weirdest
Right.
uh ones that I've seen in a long time. The way that the tire just literally just
Oh,
ripped and
it
shot off in one
launched.
piece. That
Yeah.
was, yeah, that was crazy and stuff. And then because of that, it broke a bunch of other critical parts, threw all kinds of
Mm.
debris across the track and
Yep.
everything. So
Yep.
again, because of the amount of debris that flew off the car and everything after he hit, the initial impact, other than the tire going, airborne and flying, 50 feet behind him, it didn't look
Yeah.
like it was, like it was too terrible. But boy, I mean, I guess he must have really hit it hard, because I mean, like I said, he was throwing
Yeah.
bits and pieces
Oh
of the
yeah.
suspension all over the track and everything, which, anytime you've got suspension pieces or carbon fiber,
Right.
that's carbon, torn up carbon fiber is basically like razor blades. And so it's something that you definitely have got to, make sure that you get every bit of it up, or otherwise you're going to wind up with, some pretty significant punctures and everything. And
Right.
that was a pretty quick part of the track too, that, you
Yeah.
don't want to, be having somebody deflating, or getting a puncture right in that area.
Right. And it was all over the racing line too. So they definitely had to do something about that. And then going on to that last restart, that
Well, first of all, before we jump into that, let me
yeah.
say, with only 3 laps to go, I'm still not totally convinced that it was really necessary for them to do the third restart. That after they had done the second restart, first of all, I'm still questioning whether it was and maybe, maybe it's something that's in the sporting regulations that I'm not aware of, that said that they had to do that because they had to go the full distance. But I know that after the halfway point, it is considered an official race. And by official, I mean that full points are awarded. So even if they do have to stop the race early for some reason, full points are awarded and it's considered an official race. Same thing as if they had actually had run to the full 2 hours, it would still be considered an official race, even if it was a couple laps short. So I still question whether it was even necessary for them to even do that second restart or third restart, after K-Mag's shunt, that was it even necessary to even do it at that point. But again, like I said, there may be something in the sporting regulations that I'm not aware of that says that they had to go to, full laps, because they were still under the time limit of 2 hours for the race. So then we get into the third restart, and that was just complete chaos. I mean, we get into, the first corners, Seitz and Alonso come together. He spins, first of all, you got to feel for for Aston Martin. That looked like that their day had completely gone in the dumper, in the matter of 2 corners, because Alonso gets spun off, by Seitz. Lance Stroll takes and is able to charge through, is in third place. So he takes over third place. And then on cold tires, he locks up and goes across the gravel trap and loses all those places. So at that point, they go from, to a podium and a point and a very, high points paying position to basically being at the back of the grid, so that if they hadn't done that third red flag, they would have been completely out of luck. They would have seen their entire weekend go completely out the window. You had the 2 Alpines basically, implode on each other, and stuff. So they red flag it for, a third time with literally 1 lap left to go, so it's like, still not even quite sure why they even bothered doing the third restart, other than just to, again, there must be something in the sporting regulations that says, no, we have to go. If we are scheduled for 58 laps, if we're still, unless there's some other circumstances that prevents us from being able to restart the race, we have to do the full 58 laps. And maybe that's, the reason why they felt like that, even though, it was basically the last lap was more or less a parade lap, but because of that, and because, the FIA ruled that, all of this happened before they got to the first timing light in the first sector, because they never made it to the second sector, they went with the standings as they were at the restart. So this means that Alonso got his podium back, Stroll got his 5th place back, but then they take and they hand the penalty to Sites, which takes and completely screws up the whole order.
Yeah,
and we'll get into that.
Not, yeah.
And we'll get into more of that here in just a few minutes when we talk about Ferrari's woes. But, and then you've got Haas, makes a protest saying, hey, why did it, all of our sudden, our remaining driver, Hulkenberg, because of all this chaos created by this, incident at the first corner, our guy got up to 4th place. He should get to keep his 4th place. And basically they said, nope, we didn't get to the, into the second. We didn't make it through the first sector before all the chaos happened. So therefore, by the sporting regulations, we go back to the way things were, the order that it was at the start. Same way, it's the same controversy that we had at Silverstone last year when they had to red flag the race. And because all the chaos happened in the first couple of corners, they never made it into out of the first sector into the second sector. And so therefore they had no way of officially saying, okay, this is what the order is, other than to say, okay, we're going to go back to the order it was at the start.
But yeah, it's crazy though, because there was 3, maybe 2 laps left when they did the standing start. And I mean, honestly, what did the FIA think? You have that few of laps, everybody's going to gun it 1,000% because they all want that. If they can get up just a couple of spots, and then that could be the difference between points or no points. So of course there's going to be huge battles, especially the first couple of turns. So I don't know. I understand the rationale behind it.
I don't remember what year it was that they changed the sporting regulations that after a red flag that they started doing standing starts again, because once upon a time it was the start of the race was always a standing start. And then if they red flagged it within the first 3 laps, then they would do another standing start. Then if it was after the first 3 laps, anytime that if they had a red flag situation, they would do a rolling start behind the safety car for the remainder of the race.
And that makes sense. A rolling start.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yes. And it should have been a rolling start. But again, like I said, a few years ago, and I don't remember when, they changed the sporting regulations to say it should be a standing start. They do a standing start regardless as well. If the weather is dry, they do a standing start. Now, if it's wet, that changes it. And then it becomes a rolling start behind the safety car. And that can even happen even in a wet weather race. If the FIA deems that for safety reasons, they need to do so, they can even do a rolling start for the beginning of the race. But unlike rolling start later in the race where they do it single file, I believe that if they're doing it at the start of the race, they still grid up in side-by-side rows. So very much like what they do in IndyCar with all of their starts, because IndyCar doesn't do standing starts. They always do, and NASCAR is the same way, where they do rolling starts, and the beginning of the race is always done in rows of 2. Except for Indianapolis, where you have rows of 3, but we're not going to get into that. But yeah, and then on top of everything else, you have because they did for basically a glorified parade lap behind the safety car to take and get that last lap in after the 3rd red flag. You had fans that were climbing the catch fences and sneaking through gaps in the track wall, that are normally used for the marshals and everything to enter the track. Then they were actually running out onto the track while the cars were still on track in order to try to get to the podium. And it's a miracle that we didn't have a huge accident or something, or somebody getting seriously hurt. So it's like, thankfully, right. And I guarantee you some fines are probably going to come down because of that.
I would imagine so, because I mean, even though they're just behind the safety car, that doesn't mean they're going 20 miles an hour. They're still going at
Ooh,
fairly good speed. It's just not
yes,
F1 speed. So you
yes,
being on the track, you're still going to get killed.
yeah, yes, very much so. So yeah, so that was a very scary sight to see this weekend.
Right, right.
But not
So
unprecedented
yeah,
because we have seen it at other tracks and stuff too. I can remember several, incidences, especially at Monza. If for when Ferrari wins, that I have seen, the fans just absolutely, you know, charge the track.
yeah.
And sometimes while the cars were still circulating, so not good.
Yeah. Well, Monza is definitely a different beast altogether, right?
Yes, yes.
So going through to Mercedes now, talking about obviously Russell and Hamilton, uh, great showing in qualies, right?
Hmm.
Great times, even hell,
Yep.
even on track day they had great times,
Yeah.
Um, but the funny thing though is, and Martin Brundle was very funny in how he talked about it. But when Max passed Russell and then he passed Hamilton, um, you know, it was like, and just quoting him, is like seeing F1 pass an F2 car, and that's exactly what it was. It was like it was no big deal at all. Just here, watch out, let the adults play.
Hmm.
you know,
Yep.
it looked like even though both of those drivers are fantastic at what they do, they just they couldn't keep up. There's just no uh nothing that they had that could do or keep up with the Red Bull, not even close. So it's just funny to me how much that they can go in and race against something like Red Bull and think that they can be, or try to be competitive, not think, but try to be competitive. Um, do you see that changing during the season as far as different upgrades Mercedes could do, or do you think this is truly just like a one-off type race?
I would say the jury is still out. One of the technical updates that I left out of the rundown earlier was that Mercedes did bring a new update to the car. Was one of the only four team of the top four teams that actually brought any updates to Melbourne, and they had a completely reprofiled fences on the floor to take and better manage the airflow through the ground effects under the car, which I think gave definitely a pretty good bump to their performance at Melbourne. Now, whether or not that will hold going forward, time will tell. We'll have to just kind of take a wait and see on that. But and Mercedes has said that they have a very significant upgrade coming soon. I want to say, maybe as early as Azerbaijan, but I need to check on that. That
Yeah.
could make even more of an impact on their performance. So I'm
Wow.
going to say it's a maybe at this
Yeah.
point. But I mean, you're definitely right that they had a fantastic weekend, finished second and third. Or I'm sorry, they qualified second and third.
Yeah.
Um, you know, so I mean, and they were within 6/10 of a second of Max's time during qualifying. So I mean, they definitely were. But the thing was though is that this car is very much like last year's car was at the beginning of the year, where it's very Jekyll and Hyde. It's one day the car can be fantastic, and the next day it's a complete handful. And I think that's part of the problem that Mercedes is having right now is it just they're scratching their head because they can't figure out what tiny little thing is, because these, as we've talked about before, these cars are on such a knife edge and they're pushing the boundaries of physics and mechanics and everything else to such a degree that I mean, just the smallest thing can take and just completely throw off the car. And that's the problem is they're just having a hard time figuring out what that one ingredient is that's throwing the car off. And so that's why I'm saying it's a definite maybe that Mercedes is finally getting a handle on it. Maybe they finally figured it out, but maybe not. Maybe next, in a month from now in Azerbaijan, car could be totally different. So it's going to be interesting. So we'll kind of take a wait and see, look to see if the resurgence is real or if it was just a one-off. Now, I'm not going to say that they're not going to have other weekends where they're going to be at tracks where where the track and the track conditions really suit the car. And on those weekends, they will take, and Mercedes being Mercedes, they will take maximum advantage of what they're given.
Nice. Yeah. The call for Russell, I think, was an odd one at the time, right? I mean, let's even forget, for right now at least, that there was a red flag, because who could have predicted that? Taking Russell out the way that they did left Lewis completely exposed. There's no, like we're just talking about, there's just no way that they could compare to Red Bull unless he has DRS. Well, if you take that away from him, he's completely exposed, and that's what happened. I mean, Max passed him without any issues whatsoever. So, what was the strategy behind that? I know they were probably trying to undercut Max, but I mean, he slipped from first all the way down to seventh. Granted, he got a couple of spots back, but just a weird call. Or do you think that was just something that was like, do you think that was something that they should have waited a few more laps minimally before calling Russell?
Well, according to Pirelli, that the best strategy was a one-stop race where you changed, you went from the soft to the mediums. That was their calculated best course. And I think Mercedes, as Mercedes usually does, is usually they don't stick to the same strategy for both drivers. It's very rare that they do. Mercedes almost always will have different strategies for each driver. And I really think that for Russell, he was probably scheduled to come in and take on new tires probably within I would say 7 or 8 laps of when they called him in. He was probably about 7 or 8, it was probably about 7 or 8 laps sooner than what they had planned, but he was probably still within that window of when they were already planning to bring him in and swap out his tires. And I think that when Albon had the shunt and they thought it was going, and they deployed the safety car, they saw that as the perfect time to come in, because the delta between pit in and pit out under green flag conditions at Melbourne is somewhere in the ballpark of, I want to say, 23, 24 seconds. But under a safety car, that drops to 13 seconds. And I think that they thought, okay, this is the perfect time to take and bring him in, get him on his fresh tires that he's going to take through to the rest of the race. He gets to spend a couple hours, or not a couple hours, he gets to spend a couple, laps behind the safety car. And what little bit they would lose in track position, they would make up when the other drivers had to come back, come in for their stops. And so I think it was really, I think it was the right call at the time, because again, like you just said, they could not have predicted the red flag. And because of that, they thought, okay, we're in our window. Let's go ahead and box, take the advantage of the safety car, in reducing the pit delta down, and take advantage of it. And then a lap later, they call the red flag, and it was just basically bad timing. And it was just poor George, he gets caught out. And then, but the other thing too, though, is that I kind of started wondering, I didn't think of it at the time when I was watching the race, but I was thinking about it earlier today when I was writing down the rundown for today's podcast. Did the team actually know something was going on with the power unit beforehand, and that's why they called him in? Is maybe they were thinking, okay, we can call him in, and if we need to, we can retire the car at that point. And then they thought, okay, well, maybe it's not as bad as we think it is. let's send him back
Sure.
out. They send him back out, and then all the stresses and everything, thinking that, okay, well, as long as he keeps the car running, he should be okay. But then they red flag it. He comes into the pits. They have to basically restart the car. They send him back out. He has to go through all the stresses and everything of another standing start. And maybe that's what tipped it over the edge and caused his power unit to detonate after the fact. So I
that's a good word for it, detonate, because it did.
Yes. It was very reminiscent of when Jensen Buttons did the same thing at Melbourne a few years back, where, where, I mean, it just detonated. And I mean, it just fireball just coming out the back of the car and everything. It was just amazing. So, but, really unfortunate for George Russell. I mean, his first mechanical retirement of the year. And it's, only, I think, his second as a Mercedes driver. So, nice. It's only his second or third mechanical retirement since he joined Mercedes from Williams. So just a bad weekend for Russell, but he's one of those guys that you're not going to be able to keep him down. He's going to come back very strong at the next race.
He's such a great driver. Yeah, yes, no doubt about it.
Absolutely.
Right. So Aston Martin.
Yeah.
had a great weekend, then it looked like they were going to have a horrible weekend, and then it turned around and they actually turned out to get some pretty good points there. He's killing it, man. It's amazing. Like you said earlier, you go put him in a somewhat bad car, right, that he had last year, and then you put him into a good car, or I wouldn't hesitate to call it great so far. A couple more races we might be able to get there, but right now I'd say it's a good car. But you put a great driver in a good car and see what he can do. I mean, he's just blasting it, and just it's funny because him and Hamilton, he was definitely trying to get Hamilton to wear down those tires so he could eventually take that spot, and you could hear Hamilton's engineer say, no, don't fall for it, this is what he does, just race, just drive your race, you'll be fine. And he was, right? And that's exactly what he does it all the time, though. He's such a master of that kind of stuff that people don't realize what he's doing it until it's too late. I love watching that kind of racing where it's so, you have to really watch what he's doing and understand the strategy that he has going behind that. I just love it. Anyway, go ahead.
No, you hit it exactly on the nail on the head. In because if you could sit there and you could watch the gaps, and all of a sudden it would go from like a second and a half second, 1.5 to 1.8 seconds, and then all of a sudden it would go to 1 second, where it looked like Alonso was really pushing to try to get into DRS range on Hamilton. And then he would start getting, creeping up, and then he would back off, and he would creep up, and then he would back off, and he kept, he still kept within, that 2 second range, but he never quite got to that 1 second range but at the same time, like you said, the engineers kept telling Hamilton, don't use up your tires. These are gonna, and at one point Hamilton comes on the radio and says, I don't think these tires are going to last till the end of the race. And the engineers were like, yes, they will last. You can do it. They were, it was like they were coaching him throughout the entire, the last half of the race, but I think we talked about this the last podcast, is that Martin Brundle put it probably the best, that Alonso is the way that Alonso works is he uses like 20% of his brain is used for actually driving the Grand Prix, and the other 80% he's driving everybody else's race, and trying to figure out. He is so masterful at doing stuff like that, of playing, he's playing 3D chess while, a lot of the other teams are all playing checkers and stuff. He is so cerebral when he is behind the wheel, and that's what it's, if not for, some, questionable, inside the car, he very rarely puts a wheel wrong. He is such an amazing cerebral driver, that if it weren't for bad choices that he's made in the teams that he's gone to and going to the wrong team or going to what he thought was the right team and then finding out, it's when they're on, a slide as opposed to on their ascendancy, he'd probably be, a 4 or 5-time world champion if it hadn't have been for some bad choices of, changing teams and everything. So he is just, and to see this guy doing it at 41 years old is just amazing. So it's just, and yeah, you're right. It was definitely a great weekend in the final results, P3 and P4, for the weekend. Third consecutive podium for Alonso. Probably, definitely one of Stroll's best finishes in Formula One. He drove, a very quiet but very masterful race, and then with the late, penalty to Sites, which, elevates him for P. But even then, even without the penalty to Sites, I mean, he's still P5, which was still a huge points haul for the team, So yeah, it was very fortunate that the late race, chaos and everything didn't end up affecting them as bad as what it initially appeared to, after that, second restart, after the K-Mag, red flag and everything. So it, definitely, it was definitely looked like, everything was going in the dumper and then turns right around and, came back and no,
exactly.
So it was great weekend for Aston Martin. So
right. So you wanted to talk about Ferrari.
Yeah, we can't, finish up tonight without talking about Ferrari's continued woes part 2. It's like you've got Leclerc out after 2 corners, which is, which is like, it's like I was reading this and remembered a stat that like his first start in Formula One for Sauber, basically the same thing happened. He got punted out, at the first corner. And this is, second time this has happened to Leclerc at, Melbourne. And you got to almost kind of feel for the guy. It's just like, it's almost no matter how hard he's trying, it just seems like he can't win. So, it's, you got to kind of feel for the guy, but, but again, over, that when the car's good, and when Leclerc's on it, he's just sublime. And his luck's got to turn around sometime soon. So now we got to go ahead and get into, as long as we're on the subject of Ferrari, we got to go ahead and get into Sites penalty. And I totally disagree with the penalty. I really think that was the wrong call. It was a racing 100%. Incident. Even Alonso said himself after the race, he said it was too harsh. It was a racing incident. Yes, if now admittedly he can say that with the rose-colored glasses of the fact that he got his podium reinstated with the final red flag. Had it come out differently where he was relegated to the back of the pack and lost all those points, he might have said something differently. But I still think that his Sites' penalty was entirely too harsh. He should not have been penalized that much. 5 seconds, especially that late. Yeah, I think that if they were really hell bent on giving out a penalty, they should have waited until after the race, let him have the position, and then given him a grid penalty for the next race.
Right. Yeah, something like that. That would be reasonable. But 5 seconds, I mean, you're just destroying their points. And that's literally all they were doing. Right.
Nope, there was no justice there whatsoever.
All right. And now switching gears a little bit back to Red Bull. Last week we had Max starting at 15. He gets the second and gets fastest lap. Then this week we had Checo starting at 15 and he finishes at P5. Just amazing amount of strategy going behind that. Checo passing the way he did, just some masterful passing that he had going on, just moving that far, that fast along the field. And he wasn't passing just any small driver. I mean, these were really great drivers that he's passing and almost without effort, Even there was a couple of DRS trains that he was in, and he even was able to pass those. it's amazing to me to see how fast they're able to go. One question I did have though, in watching that, at first with Paulies, he goes into a sand trap, right? And at first I was looking at it, I was like, man, that's really weird because Checo doesn't make mistakes like that. He's too good of a driver. Um, so in my head I'm thinking, well, maybe he just, he lost concentration for a second, he saw a bird or whatever, right? Something like that. And then you listen back to the radio, and the radio, he's saying something to the effect of, well, this can't happen anymore. So do you think that that's a power issue, like with the car itself, or do you think that Checo just slipped? What are your thoughts on that?
No, it was definitely an issue with the car because they had a problem with the power unit kept applying power even when he was under braking. And so that was kind of it kind of causes the car to surge forward and everything. So it was definitely a mechanical issue is what forced him to, dump it in the kitty litter, during qualifying, and didn't even set a time for qualifying. So which means he started,
which is why he got 20.
Yeah, that's why he had to start from the pit lane. Actually, he wasn't,
That's right.
didn't start from 15th. He actually started from the pit lane and everything. So, which makes it an even more amazing drive. The fact that he started from the pit lane and wound up, and with Seitz's penalty was promoted all the way, promoted to P5. So yes, I mean, absolutely masterful drive. And again, it's just two things on, to kind of, add perspective to what you were saying is, first of all, the cars themselves is, as we've talked about before, Adrian Newey is just the master of making amazing cars. And the fact of the matter is that the straight line speed, especially under DRS, the straight line speed of the Red Bulls is just, they're so far ahead of everybody that it's just not even funny.
Yeah.
Because the car has so much less drag under DRS that, nobody else, it's like they are 10, 12 miles an hour faster in a straight line under DRS than any other team out there. And so, but it's like nobody can quite figure out the secret sauce that they have figured out that makes the car so good under and so fast under DRS. And everything. So, like you were saying, is even when he was stuck in a DRS train, as long as he had DRS, he was still able to pass other cars that also had DRS, just simply because the car is that much quicker in a straight line. It's just mind blowing, what that car is capable of doing. So, and then the other thing too, is this is the third race in a row where we have seen Red Bull have, in either, that in qualifying, Red Bull has had, or in practice, Red Bull has had some kind of mechanical issue. But when it comes race time, the cars are flawless and they're able to do, and in the hands of their two very, 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 very good drivers, they are able to make the most of, when they do have those mechanical issues, that their amazing drivers are able to make the absolute best of the situation and still get, maximum points on a weekend in which qualifying may not have necessarily been good, but the finish result was sublime. Because he just, and Max is just on cruise control right now. It's just, it's basically crazy. Because the car is just so good. He is he's on cruise control. It's like he pulls out a 10-second lead on Lewis and just was able to just perfectly hold that, 10, 11 second gap, and just, and basically he was just out there for a Sunday drive.
Well, the thing is, I think it was on turn 13. He does a spin out and he still cruises along. He still gets. I think he lost like 3 or 4 seconds, maybe. He still. I mean, it wasn't even close to being worried.
No.
Still didn't have Lewis in his rears. So it's again, it's just amazing to me how much further he is. And really, they were telling him not to push it very far. I think that he probably could have
Hmm.
gone even further ahead, but they were like, "Eh,
Oh
just
yeah.
save the engine."
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And see, and that's one of the things that, as they definitely are much more conscientious of that now, that, because of the limited number of power units and limited number of parts on the power unit that they're allowed to change before they start taking penalties, they do have to be much more conscientious of that. And so, yeah, instead of, Max could have probably easily, red flag notwithstanding, with the final, quote unquote parade lap for the last lap,
Yeah. Right.
that, before the red flag situations, he could have been easily 30, 40 seconds up the road from
Mhm.
Lewis. But because, like I said, they have to be much more conscientious of
Right.
preserving the car and preserving the components on the car and everything nowadays, that, like, that they have to be, that they did, the engineers did have to tell Max, okay, try to, ease up your pace, conserve the car, conserve
Mhm.
the power unit and things like that. Like we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, I was talking about, 98 when Coulthard and Hakkinen lapped the entire field. And back then they didn't have the restrictions on the power units and stuff. If they,
Yeah.
they could take and lap the entire field, and the next race they would have a fresh, you know, fresh engine. They'd have a
That's
fresh V10 in the
crazy.
back of the car the following weekend, which was great, and stuff. But
Yeah.
it's, so yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, Max definitely could have won by way more. Red flags
Right.
notwithstanding, he could have been way further
Yeah.
up the road.
Yeah. All right. Going to McLaren. So they finally get on the board. Finally have
Yeah.
more points than Danny Rick now.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Up until the start of this weekend, Daniel Ricciardo had the same amount of points as the entire McLaren team, and he doesn't even have a car,
Oh, I think that's
which was
hilarious.
awesome.
Yeah.
Yes, it was. It was so good. But yes, so they go from dead last in the constructors' points total to jump all the way up to fifth. Had a very, very good weekend. Both drivers in the points. Piastri gets his first points, and gets him in front of his home crowd. So, which being the only Australian driver on the grid at the moment, was definitely, he had the whole city of Melbourne behind him and everything. Being from Melbourne himself. So it was definitely, a great weekend for McLaren. And they are another one of those teams that has a very, very large upgrade package coming online in the next one or two races. That it's like, it looks like that McLaren is definitely moving in the right direction at this point. Okay, I think it's time to box, and retire to the garage.
Love it. Love it.
So we'll yeah. Yeah. So we'll go ahead and put this one to bed, and we'll be coming back to you in 4 weeks when the circus comes to Azerbaijan for what I could be considered to be one of the crazier street circuits on the calendar.
Yeah. Sure.
And so until next time, for Corey Brune, I'm Scott Vick saying stick to the medium tires and don't pitch it in the kitty litter. Bye-bye.